Good morning, everybody. I'm, as you can see, back home again after a brief excursion to Glenabbey's building. But things change, and here I am back in the study, back in the red chair that's becoming all too familiar, to talk about 1 Peter in our series. And a major feature of Peter's letter is that he doesn't sugarcoat what it means to be a Christian. He doesn't sentimentalize God's grace. God's grace involves suffering. It did for the Lord Jesus, and it does for us. And being sentimental doesn't help us to face reality. Rather, Peter is writing to provide us with a place where we can stand firm and secure. And that place is in God's true grace. Now, suffering takes many forms, and not all of them are talked about in 1 Peter, but a number are. And here in chapter 2, where we are, the focus is on unjust suffering. That is the suffering we experience in life as believers, not because of doing good, but despite doing what is good. Dear friends, he begins, brothers and sisters who I love, I appeal to you as resident aliens. So his appeal is based both on the shared love for one another and on their shared status as outsiders in this world. Outsiders because they trust and love and are loyal to Jesus, the King the world has rejected and still rejects, which means that the world around is not particularly at ease with us, and we're not particularly at ease with it. And this awkward and often uneasy relationship with the world around us is complicated by the fact, according to Peter, that there is an internal war within us, a war in the realm of our desire. So this is where he starts. And he appeals to us not to give in to the pull of sinful desires. Now, we all experience desire within us. It is a positive, powerful part of what it means to be a human being. The problem comes when our human capacity for desire gets wrapped around the wrong thing, on sinful things. Now, when Peter writes about what's sinful here, he's very aware that in his day there was, by and large, very little notion in the world at large about sin. Many would have laughed at the ideas. The Romans were very tolerant and very permissive, which is one reason that the early Christian leaders, like Peter, needed to teach new converts what sin was, that certain behaviors were wrong. And also today in the 21st century West in particular, it seems to me that we have largely lost the notion of sin, of things that we should abstain from because they are not simply harmful to our health or to our fitness, but because they are in themselves wrong. In fact, people laugh at the concept, dismiss it as old-fashioned, negative, judgmental, repressive, even unhealthy. But if we're to be loyal to Christ, we will find ourselves out of step with the world, because Jesus was and is. He spoke a great deal about sin. He taught the reality of sin as a universal disease that can't be dealt with by education or choosing a different political system or social engineering, for the simple reason that it's not what comes into us from the environment around us that defiles us, but it's what comes out of us that defiles us. It's what comes out of the heart. And he gave a list: evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, and slander. These things are both sinful in themselves, but they're also symptomatic of a deeper underlying cause, this universal disease of sin, of human rebellion against God. As Peter puts it at the end of this chapter, we're all like sheep, And the characteristic of sheep is to go their own way, choose independence. Sheep have very little imagination, if any. They see a gap in the hedge and they go for it. They can't see the bigger picture of all the dangers and the problems and how much healthier it would be not to go through the gap, but rather to stay with the shepherd. Loyalty to Jesus means choosing to go against any desire that we sense that has got itself wrapped around the wrong things. And that's not easy. According to Peter, it's war. It's a war against our souls. That is against our very lives. The aim of the enemy in this war is actually to destroy our life. So following sinful desires is not a way to get a life, it's a way to destroy a life. But as Peter says, we're a bit like sheep. We can't see beyond the immediate. We just tendency to go our own way, to follow our noses and our eyes. A little bit like a mouse who sees the chocolate or the cheese and can't see the bigger picture of how dangerous it would be to go for it, and just goes for it and destroys its life. We need, says Peter, to expect a battle, and it's a long, hard, lifelong battle. He uses the present tense here because it's not easy. And sometimes desire will so fill our horizon that we can't see anything else. It's a bit like buying something on impulse when you're in a shop and you allow yourself to be persuaded, and then when you're out in the street you suddenly realize what you've done. But it is done. Of course, the great thing with Christianity, with the gospel, with Christ, is that forgiveness is real, which means that it is never too late to engage seriously in this battle. You may have lost a battle or two, but don't allow your defeats to convince you that there's no point getting up and getting engaged in the war again. There's every point. It's never too late to get a life. But in addition to this internal battle, there is pressure from the world around us. As Christians, we live amongst people by and large who do not know God. And in that condition of not knowing God, they have a different set of values very often from us. And from their perspective, in that different set of values, they will often accuse us of all kinds of wrongdoing in their eyes, according to Peter. In the first century, one of the major accusations was that Christians were political revolutionaries, because there was a fear in the Roman world of increasing Christian presence being a destabilizing factor, particularly in the area of slavery. Would the Christian leaders incite Christian slaves to fight literally for their freedom? It seemed to them as a ticking time bomb. And today, there are all kinds of misrepresentations and false accusations hurled against believers. Intolerant, homophobic bigots, anyone? How do we deal with that kind of thing? Well, we make sure that there is no proper justification for such accusations. But then positively, says Peter, we're to fill our lives with good things. That stops in the end the criticism, not at the beginning, but in the end, people will come to recognize it. And Peter now proceeds to work out what this looks like in three different public contexts. The first is that of society at large, and especially with regard to society's institutions and government. The second is the workplace, and the third is marriage. Now, these three areas share three common key elements. The first is this, that the basic distinctive Christian attitude is to be that of submission, whatever that means. But that's the key thing. That's the first one. The second is that the call to Christian submission is in the context of unjust suffering. Now, this is a little bit confused by the NIV translation, unfortunately, in verse 20 of this chapter, where it reads, if you suffer for doing good. That's not correct. The actual wording should read, if you do good and suffer. Not even do good and suffer for it. It's just do good and suffer. That is, in spite of doing good, we suffer. He talks later about suffering because we do good, but this is suffering in spite of the fact that, for example, in work you do a good job and you're still treated unfairly. You're not being treated unfairly because you do a good job. It's just unfairness. It's the way life so often is. And the third common element is this, that how we live and behave, and in particular, how we react to such unjust suffering, is a major part of our witness to Christ and his gospel. And it is this that seems to me to be the overriding principle in Peter's thinking. If we miss everything else, let's not miss this. When it comes to how we live, how we interact with people, and particularly how we react to personal injustice, for the Christian, the overriding principle is very different from what it is for those who are not Christians, because it is not my rights first. It is the gospel first. It is my role and calling as a witness to be an effective witness to Christ in whatever circumstances I find myself, pointing the way for others to come to know the Good Shepherd who died for them. And of course, the great example that Peter gives in this chapter is that of Jesus himself. And Peter had a front row seat as to how the Lord Jesus reacted to injustice. He himself did no wrong, as Peter reminds us. And yet they reviled him, they hurled their insults at him, they tortured him, they perverted justice with him, and they killed him. By definition, the supreme act of injustice in human history, because this was none other than the Creator's Son. How did Jesus react? Amazing, counterintuitive, countercultural, not demanding his rights, not using his supernatural power to extract retribution, but enduring the injustice. But if we ask why he did that, the answer is a gospel answer. He did it so that he could die for you and for me. So that while we were going our own way, just like sheep, we would now have a way opened up for us to return to the shepherd of our souls. Now, each of these three areas is a massive subject on its own. I'm going to sketch in the first two in the few minutes that remain. Chris is going to talk about the third one, marriage, next week. The important thing, though, is that each of us think, pray, and then together talk these things through. For this teaching is not only counterintuitive, it's countercultural. It's deeply challenging to the cultural norms that are all around us and which we, whether we realize it or not, have probably accepted and adopted many of them as our own. So first, society and its institutions. We are called upon to submit ourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Now, submission has very negative connotations most of the time, of coercion, of inferiority, of bullying, and so on. But Peter is talking about something very positive and very important, something without which it's basically impossible for life to function. There needs to be a basic authority structure. That's true, for example, in sport. Teams need to submit to a captain, to a coach, if they are to work properly and play well. And there needs to be a referee who is subject to the laws or rules of the game if the game is to be played at all. Imagine no referee, no laws. It would be completely chaotic. The games, the sports, whatever they are, would be impossible to play and therefore impossible to enjoy. If you get rid of authority, you get rid of the game itself. God is not anti-authority. Jesus, the Son of God, voluntarily subjected himself to his Father. It is no more an insult to us to be asked to submit to authority than it was to him to submit to authority. It's not a weakness, it's a strength. And our modern frequent reaction to submission and any kind of hierarchy and authority is both silly and dangerous, because to get rid of all authority in the end is to destroy ourselves. Let's remember that the basic Christian confession is this: Jesus Christ is Lord, which means that I'm not Lord. We're to be subject, says Peter, both at high level, king or emperor, at the lower levels as well, of the variety of government officials and in other institutions. And we should remember that Nero was the supreme power with a dictator's power. Government is never perfect at any human level, but it is to be respected. This is not about liking the individual who happens to be prime minister or first or deputy first minister. It is about the institutions of government. And there are, of course, limitations to this submission. For example, when it comes to obeying Christ's command to get on with sharing the gospel. But the Christians of the first century were not a rebellious force. They were not a political threat to the stability of the country, to the government. They didn't start riots. They didn't hold protest marches against the government and the religious authorities. They got on with what the Lord had called them to do with wisdom and grace, prepared to accept the consequences, including the consequences when, on occasions, they had to disobey what the authorities were telling them to do, such as not talk about Jesus. Despite that, there was a lot of false accusations against them. How were they to silence those? By doing good. This is God's will, Peter writes. This is not just a matter of, in fact, it's not a matter at all of passive politics. It's a matter of what God's will is. The Christians didn't go around stirring up civil unrest by encouraging the slaves to revolt. They preached the gospel. And as the gospel impacted one individual after another, as people turned to Christ, they also returned to God's valuation of human beings. And slavery was gradually dismantled without Christians getting involved in violence and bloodshed. We are free men and women, says Peter, in the sense that we are sons and daughters of the King of Kings. Live as free men and women with dignity and respect, but don't use this freedom as an excuse for a rebellious spirit, an excuse to do what we like, an excuse for disobedience. Instead, live as servants of God. If we claim Jesus as Lord, then for the Lord's sake, we will be subject to human institutions. Secondly, and very briefly, our work. There isn't an exact parallel between the New Testament workplace of household slavery, for example, and a modern workplace where the social structures are very different, where we've all kinds of laws and rules and rights designed to protect people from abuse and exploitation. But taking account of all these differences, and we need to do that, the same principle of submission applies. We just need to think through carefully how it should be applied in our own circumstances. We are to submit to those who are in authority, to our bosses, with all respect, not simply to those who have earned our respect, but to those who haven't, not just to the good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. And this is not easy. It feels so unfair, so unjust, because it is unjust. But there is another principle at work here, and that is the principle of grace. See verse 19. The NIV translates it with the word, it is commendable if you take this unjust suffering. Actually, the word is, it's grace with God if you take it. Because this is where we stand. And we demonstrate that we have experienced God's grace by being prepared to take injustice. Because if God had insisted on giving me exactly what I deserved, then I would have been lost forever. Think of it this way, says Peter. If you do wrong and suffer as a result, that's no big deal if you take your punishment as a result because you deserve it. There's no credit in taking punishment that you deserve. But if you do well and still suffer in spite of doing well, and you take that and endure it and keep going graciously, this is commendable. This shows the grace of God. And it's this that we're called to, says Peter. It is part and parcel of our calling to be prepared to suffer unjustly because we are following Christ. And he left us his example to follow. Now, finally, let's notice just a couple of things about that. We are not being asked to pretend that injustice is fair. Jesus made it very clear to the high priest that what was happening was unjust. Nor are we being asked to take it as if we deserved it. Jesus made it perfectly clear to Pilate that he was completely innocent of the charges brought against him, as Pilate himself confirmed. In addition, we're not being asked to forget about justice. Jesus didn't. But he, says Peter, entrusted his cause to the one who judges righteously, God himself. Justice will be done. God will hold everyone to account. And this is one of the reasons that convinces me of the truth of Christianity, because there's no justice in atheism. Injustice just is. It happens. Death ends everything. And no one will ever be held to account. And the person who has killed hundreds or thousands of people in this life with his bombs and his poison and gets away with it will never have to face it. But that's not going to happen, because God will judge. We are called to follow Christ's footsteps. And who knows, our willingness to follow Christ, to take injustice, to keep on positively doing good, may be the very thing that convicts some who oppose us and who insult us, who misrepresent us. It might convict them of their need for the same grace as we have found and the grace in which we stand.